Hi, I'm Sara Van Zee, and I'm the mission director here at First Reformed Church. And I'm here today with Pat Dirkse. He is coming from the City of Compton, from the Church of Compton. Pat, do you want to tell us a little bit about what that is and where it's located and what you do?
Yeah, glad to be with you and spend time today. We moved into the City of Compton 11 years ago, just with a heart and a mission to feel the same hurt and pain that our neighbors do. You know, part of it for us was wanting to begin to live in our community. Incarnational presence was important to us. And so we moved and started City Church of Compton 11 years ago, and I'm glad to be there. I'm married to my wife, Julie. We got 2 kids. Joshua is 11. Anna is 8. And it's been a complete joy to be a part of this church plant and this experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I want to ask you, what is your why? Like, why? Because you were at Emmanuel Church for 9 years. And when I think about the age of your son, who's 11, and you're saying City of Compton Church was 11 years old, like, there was a lot happening in your life at that time. Like, what was the one thing that you knew that God was calling you to this? What is your why?
Yeah, I think a large part of that for us was quite a discernment process. We did not have probably a clear why of what's going to be next. We loved our time at Emmanuel. Typically, people would come, have your seminary experience, get to be there, and then they have sent, 100-plus interns who have been there over the years. We were on the pastoral team and really trying to figure out what was next. So we started to explore multiple options, and really, we had 3 options. We were trying to figure out where the next place is that we were going to go. One of those was Phoenix, Arizona. We would go out there and we visited to figure out, like, is this the church for us out there? And now I visited my friend in July. It was like 120 degrees outside.
Like,
I remember 3 times over lunch he asked me this question. Are you okay? And it's like, did you bring me out to the desert to die? What are we doing here? But all kidding aside, I think the church was a very affluent church, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I felt in my own immaturity that my concern for myself would be that I could potentially come and pastor here and feel like I didn't need Jesus, and that concerned me. And so I felt like beyond the 100-plus degree weather, it's like, I don't know if I'm mature enough even to be here. And which really led 2 options for us for a really long time. And my wife and I would go on walks in Paramount, trying to discern, God, what's next for us. And we would walk, and we were looking at a spot in Boise, Idaho, and then wondering, should we plant a church in Compton? That's part of the vision that Emmanuel had, is to go westward into the heart of LA, and Compton was the first city over. And so we were trying to figure out, God, where do you want us? And we would walk, and oftentimes my wife and I, as we'd walk, I think for me, I felt like these are 2 great options. The will of God is a way of life. God wants you to love God and love others, be faithful to God and be faithful to others. And these are 2 good options, and just walk through one of these doors. And my wife was very certain that God was going to speak clearly to us on where the next spot was going to be. And so we would walk, and we'd say, God, make it clear, Would you write it in the sky? That became our prayer of, like, and we would joke of, like, would it say Boise in the sky, or would it say, Compton in the sky? And we would walk, and honestly, we didn't really have much that was going on in that time. So we thought we'd take our cues from the Bible, and Gideon put a fleece out. So I got a fleece out of my closet and brought it outside, and we said, hey, if the fleece is wet and the ground is dry in the morning, we'll go to Compton. If it's the other way around, we'll go to Boise. And we went outside the next day, and the fleece was dry. And so was the ground. We had nothing. I mean, it was, it's like, okay, God doesn't want to do reruns. This is probably not his thing. He's way more creative than that. So we kept praying and trying to discern and have conversations. And we got to a spot where you found, for me, that God was breaking my heart a lot more often. And it was around great theologians like Bono, who was one who did a prayer breakfast about that time. And he would begin to talk about God's in the cardboard box where the poor play house, God's in the slums, God is with the mother who infected her child with a disease that will take both their life, and God is with us, and we are with them. And it was like, why am I crying through this, And as a rural kid from Wisconsin who listened to Tupac's Changes, it was just always a good song growing up. And now I'm hearing the same song and go, this is a lament of the city. And just felt like my heart's breaking and my posture is getting more that way towards the city. But ultimately didn't have full clarity of what that was. And so we would have lots of conversation, do lots of walking, ask God to write it in the sky, and many times weren't getting the result. And then there was a time during the week where we had a conversation with Pastor Ken of just kind of how we were feeling, and I think that was a Monday. It was like, all right, no real clarity. Let's have another conversation on Friday. But I think we were starting to lean towards Compton. And then Tuesday happened. My wife was teaching at the time. She went to school. She called me halfway through the day and said, I think we're supposed to go to Compton. And I was like, I think so too. But same God who called us on Tuesday will still have that on Friday. So let's just wait, And she got home, and then we had dinner and started having a conversation. And we're having this conversation, and it just felt for both of us in our spirit of like, we need to go to Compton. This is what we need to do. Now, Pastor Ken only lived a few houses down, so it was 8 o'clock. We're like, should we call him? So we call him. He walks down. He has this conversation. We're like, we're in. We want to plant a church. We feel like this is what God's making clear to us. And he left, and after he left, we just were too amped up to go to bed. And it was like, you want to go for a walk? And so we went for a walk. And as we were walking close to in Paramount, local Starbucks that was there, and kind of having this conversation with Julie, and I was like, hey, do you feel like God made it clear? And she's like, yeah, I think God made it clear. I'm like, yeah, do you feel like you wrote it in the sky? And then we just started to cross the street, and she's like, yeah, I think he wrote it in the sky. I said, no, you said he was going to write it in the sky. And right after I said that, we both looked up and saw the biggest shooting star that went from Paramount to Compton. And it was like, grab your mouth moment, and Julie starts crying. I'm like, pick up your jaw. I can't believe what we just saw. And it felt like for us, part of the why from the beginning has been, we're just trying to follow the next step of where God's leading. And I think, too, it felt like, hey, God's calling us to, those who feel marginalized and those who feel like they've been pushed to the outside. And when we're with them, I think we're going to find Jesus there. And I think that's been part of our story along the way.
Yeah. I think some of the people who might be listening are like, well, that's somebody else's story. Because, God talks to other people in very big ways. But you're saying it was like these small, tiny steps of obedience with confirmation.
Yes.
And so maybe what would you say to the person listening who feels that uneasiness or that stirring, or well, I feel like God has something for me, but I don't even know where to go next.
Yeah. And I'll say too, we went to a retreat after that. We told our story to people who were trying to explore whether they were going to come with us. And a response that people started leaving with was, oh, I'm waiting for my shooting star.
Yeah.
And we just had to have a moment of hey, we got to stop a minute. The shooting star didn't come before, and then you made the decision. The shooting star came, and that felt like an affirmation of what you felt like God already called you to. And so for us, I think it's many times, that was a process. It took a long time for us to get there. And so I would first tell people to be patient. We're far more in a hurry than God is. And so be patient, be faithful in seeking God. I think what we told people is kind of the same thing of the Gideon story of God doesn't want to do a rerun, and God's probably not going to give you a shooting star. And I think what we found for people on our team who came with us was God does want to give you a story. And we had people who had a dream that they were there. That was part of their affirmation of a decision they were gone. One person was at a conference, and at a conference, they just felt like the Lord was speaking to them of going, and the spouse was like, great, I'm into. God called you, I'm with you. So, and so there was multiple stories that were going on. So know that God wants to do a new thing. He wants to begin to speak to each one of us. We sometimes tell people the mandate of being a child of God is to hear the Father's voice. And so part of what we want people to do is like spend some time listening. I think a lot of times I'm not hearing anything because I'm also not stopping and pause.
Yeah. And were there times where you felt like, this is dangerous. This is unsafe. Like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Susie actually says to the beaver, she's like, oh, good, we're going to go meet Aslan and join what he's doing. She's like, is he safe? And the beaver looks at her and he says, well, of course he's not safe, but he's good. And oftentimes I think that when we start feeling those stirrings, we can push them off because they're like, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, that doesn't sound safe. I mean, you obviously were having a young family at that time. Like, were there those moments where you're like, really? Are you calling us to this? Like, this feels uncertain and unsafe.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the beginning, there was definitely a spot of feeling unsettled, of trying to figure out, like, hey, what's the next step for us? But I think for us, it was then going back to, we feel called, and we're going to have to go back to the faithful moments that God has had in our life to live into. And so we knew before we moved, it's like, having a conversation with my wife of like, there's going to be a day coming up where we're going to say we're hanging on to a shooting star because this is hard. I think there's, felt like a lot of confirmation of the very place that we were supposed to be as well. And so I think, living into that. But I think, Compton's been, before we moved, consistently ranked in the top 10 of the most dangerous cities in America. And I will say, it never really felt to us like, have there been scary moments along the way of something? Sure, but we never live in fear of where we're at. In fact, it's strange for outsiders to come and start talking to our kids and feel like it must be so scary, and they're kind of confused of like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
This is life every day.
Yep.
And we feel, you follow the Prince of Peace, and the byproduct is you receive peace. And I think, so it's continued to, I think, go back to, hey, has God been faithful? He hasn't failed us yet. So how do you keep leaning on that?
Yeah, I like that. With any ministry, like, there are so many ways that we show up, and our not enoughness is just like blatantly in our face. What are some ways that you've seen, like, God's called you to something, but in your flesh, your not enoughness has actually been the thing that ministered in your community?
Man, I think that is a regular feeling for us of like, God, this is all I got. I mean, I think it feels like trying to go back to, again, scripture and stories that have shaped us of like, I don't have a ton, but what can I give? It's 5 loaves and 2 fish. This is all I got, and it feels silly to only be offering this. And so I think it's really trying to maximize some of the space that we've had, and just to feel like we got a ball. You want to come over? We'll play a game, and feel like let's engage. Let's be in relationship. And so I think, all your insecurities that go in moving and being in a new place. I think you come face to face with those, and then also feel like this is what I got. I'm going to go back to, I'm called, and what's the next faithful step we should do? And so I think for us, it's just been, however simple that is, of, the very first year we were there, it's moving to, all right, let's just be a presence for quite a while, and then we don't have much, but here's what we can give. Let's have a meal. Let's begin to, here's some games we can play. Here's an Easter egg hunt. Let's open up our space that we have, and try and make room for people. And so I think that's been kind of a push for us of trying to push back past our insecurities and our uncomfort, and just go like, all right, God, I need you to come through. I mean, deliver a sermon. I don't feel like I got much. This is what I got, and I feel like God will become enough in it.
Yeah. And have you ever had that moment where you're the ones in need?
Yes.
And the whole community was like, "We got you."
Yeah. Absolutely. Early on, we had, lived in Compton for 6 months, and we were going back to Wisconsin. And it felt like, hey, do you tell your neighbors that you're going to be gone? Or does it feel like, no, you really shouldn't broadcast to your neighbors that you're going to be gone?
Right.
And so Big John and Charles were right across the street. They're kind of the OGs of the neighborhood. They'd be standing outside each day. John was the one who taught me how to grow my greens. And so I'm like, I think it's going to be better to go and tell them than just be gone. And so I went over and started talking with them for a while. And they just said, hey, you might see another guy over here. Ramiro's going to be watching our house, but he's probably not going to be here as often as us. We're going to be gone for the next week. Hey, if you could look after our place, that'd be great. And Big John stopped, and he's like, oh, we'll make this PG instead. He was like, oh, no one's going to F with the pastor's stuff. And he said that about 3 times, like, oh, we're going to look out. You got to be a fool to go up in there.
Yeah.
And we're going to be watching out. And so I think part of it, too, is in our vulnerability, we watched our neighbors care deeply for us. And that's what they did. They looked after our stuff. Everything's been fine. Even in the times, I think we find Compton, for many people, carry a hard reputation, but we have just watched the generosity of our neighbors. We did have a sad incident, it's probably 3 years in, when our shed got broken into and some people stole tools. And then quickly, Compton, I jokingly say, is the biggest small town I've ever been a part of, because similar to the town I grew up in and even Orange City, I would say it doesn't take long for people to, catch word of what's happened. And people found out quickly that our shed got broken into. And I started having neighbors come over with tools from their own shed saying, hey, I don't know what got taken, but here's a circular saw. My husband never uses it. You can have his. And just watched, spots that felt like, boy, this was a deficit and a loss. You begin to find our neighborhood we feel like rich people because of our neighbors who step in and love and help out.
Yeah. We briefly talked about the 5 C's of currency.
Yes.
I would love for you to share that with whoever's listening.
Yes.
Like, what are those 5 C's that you see in currency in our society?
Yeah. I think for us, kind of we talk about capital, and many of us, when we talk about capital, tend to think about dollars and cents, right? It's like, how's your portfolio doing? Is it up or down? Many of us don't want to talk about it because it's not much of one, right? Or whatever. And so for us, when we think through our neighborhood and really think throughout the scriptures, is we've called it the 5 capitals. And so the number 1 capital we see is spiritual capital. And many times the currency that goes on in spiritual capital is wisdom and power. Example would be, in Acts, and they say, silver and gold I do not have, but what I do give you is be made well, get up and walk, right? And so you see there's spiritual power at work. And then the next one is relational capital. And relational capital is the currency, typically is family and friends. It's who we're connected with and where we find family and friends to belong to. The third one would be physical capital. Physical capital is time and energy. We all get 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. No one gets more time, but our energy can change. I get to be on a college campus and feel like youth, you're staying up far later than I am. And so there's a lot of energy that you have, and how do you maximize and capitalize on that? And then there's the fourth one's intellectual capital, which is usually measured in ideas and creativity. And so that's why getting education is great. And then finally, there's financial capital, which is measured in dollars and cents. And many times in our culture, we flip that on its head and tend to we're running after financial capital when I think we many times, and it's important, we should never ignore any one of the capitals either. But I think what we sometimes find when people talk about a poverty, we can go through all 5 of these looking at poverty as well, right? So you know, financial capital, if you don't have dollars and cents and you can't make rent, that's a poverty, right? It's a loss. You need more of it. Intellectual capital, if you feel like you don't have creativity or ideas, it's hard to progress to the next area. And so we feel like that's a lack. Physical, I think many of us, you know, there's chronic illness or disease and feel like you lose energy along the way. And you know, that's a poverty that we might experience or a hardship that goes along the way. Relationships, it feels like to be poor if you don't have anyone to call, right? If we're in the middle of the night, people have sometimes asked, who's your top 5? If you had to call people at 2 a.m., do you have anyone on your list? And to feel like, all right, here's people we could reach out to. And then finally, spiritual capital, you know, the greatest poverty that exists is not knowing Jesus as your Lord and Savior. And so part of it for us is to feel like sometimes people see our city and see the lack because they only see from a lens of finances. But I think what we many times find is the richness of community that we begin to have, which sometimes might come out of necessity because you can't rely on, you know, the financial capital to pay for services of preschool or childcare or whatever else. And it's like, hey, Sarah, can you watch my kids, you know? But then it helps us lean on each other, and we actually find we become more rich because we're having a family connection. And so those are some of the capitals we kind of begin to use to look at to shape our culture.
And I would say this week we were able to meet with the people who did come with you to Compton the last time. And one of the things that they talked about was seeing the richness of that, just that community capital. And I think it's really good for us as we're partnering to recognize those things in one another and how each partnership helps us to identify, like, wow, what am I holding really important and I'm missing out on a different area. So I love thinking about it in those 5 areas that when we partner, that we can recognize in the people that we're partnering that they are rich in so many areas, and we're not just coming because we have all the answers, but together everyone's enriched. So
that's been some of the joy of coming back, I think. And, you know, I've graduated from Northwestern College and sort of be back on campus after almost 20 years. But I love the education I received, and I feel like it's top notch. But I feel like beyond the intellectual capital was, you know, getting to see Marlon on campus, who gave an investment in me, getting to see, you know, there's Dr. Mead and there's Professor Andres, and, you know, you get to kind of walk around and see these people who gave an interest beyond the classroom, which I think is what makes, you know, this place, Orange City, such a gift, because we got to meet with the mission team that was here, or the group that came out to visit us, and it's the joy of seeing each other again, right? We feel more rich being together.
Yeah. So tell us about, you have a thing called the lab that you are trying to get up and running. It's one of the areas that we really are feeling that strong partnership with you, in an area that we're really feeling like, yes, we want to get behind this. Tell us, what is the lab? Let's start there. Just tell us, what is the lab? Like, what's the goal of the lab? What are you doing?
Yeah. So the lab is a 4,400 square foot building, 2-story building. It's 2 blocks from where we live and do church currently right now. And the lab for us is the intersection of ministry and marketplace. So part of it is we've lived into the ministry work of church and missional communities and discipling people for the last 10 years. We're going to continue on with that. There's been support groups that have gone out, right, of ways to be supporting each other. But over the last 10 years, too, about 6 years ago, we started some marketplace activities of starting a catering business. So I also run a catering business. I think part of the conviction was I wanted to live like the people in our community. And the reality is, for many people in our community, they tend to be bivocational, or what I like to say, co-vocational, called to multiple vocations. And so we see this place as a creative workspace. We see it as a spot where our community can gather. We see it as a place where people will be inspired along the way, and we see it as a spot of healing that people can encounter. And so some of the marketplace activities that will happen in there will be a coffee shop in the front and a roastery. And then we've also done our catering business, which is kind of barbecue, smoked meats, sides and sweets is what we do. So we'll have a delivery kitchen out of the back that will help us there. Why marketplace is important to us? You asked me a why question earlier. And it feels like, really from the beginning, God wants the very first thing is he wants to be in relationship with us. The very next thing that he does is gives us a job to do, right? Before the fall, like we can expect to work in heaven. And part of it, what we begin to see is to feel like giving people jobs in our community is good news. And so the marketplace is very much a missional bent for us as well. But we'll also have, ministry opportunities. So our church will meet over in the lab as well in youth space. There is Mayo Elementary, which is right across the street. We'll run an after-school program out of the lab and resource kids in our neighborhood with homework help. In addition to that, we have someone who is a therapist in our community and just really wants to promote people to live in a more healthy way, and particularly around mental health. And so how do we support people in our community who are experiencing anxiety, depression, bipolar? How do we become a help for people there? And she also wants to see clients there professionally, and so she wants some office space. And so part of the lab for us is ultimately the creative workspace that brings our community together. I have a friend who works at a restaurant, and he says you need to listen to the restaurant. And so I feel like, because it's going to speak to you, and I feel like you got to listen to your community because it's going to speak to you and actually what it wants and needs. And I think what we begin to see is there are very few gathering spots in our community. In fact, one crazy story is about 2 years ago, there were 4 girls that came to our gate on our property, and they asked, can we do a Bible study here? And I thought they knew the Escobars, who are our pastors there. So I'm like, yeah, help yourself, and they walked in the gate and sat on the picnic table and started doing a Bible study. And then I saw Vivi outside, and I'm like, hey, do you know the girls that are over there? And she's like, I don't know who that is. And then I felt really bad because that was a really lousy introduction and greeting to them. And so I went over to them and kind of said, hey, I want to apologize. How did you hear about us?
Right.
And they're like, well, because we live in a residential neighborhood, but it's not a steeple with a sign on front, right? And they're on our property. It's like, well, we saw on our phone that this was a church. And we really don't know of a place in the city after 3 o'clock that we can actually meet at. And so we're just looking for a spot together. And so I think part of what we begin to find is people tend to want to find a spot together around something to drink, around something to eat, to be inspired and be pushed for a change. Part of the inspiration we want to bring is through an after-school program. The inspiration we want to bring is through a class we lead called Starting Right, the Essentials of Running a Small Business. So beyond our businesses, we want to promote other people to start their own in the city. And then we ultimately want people to experience healing through church, through counseling, through an encounter with Jesus along the way.
Yeah, I think that's great. So we've talked a lot about big picture and about kind of that 2,000-foot view of what you're doing. How can First Reformed Church, in a very tangible partnership kind of way, what are some things that we can do to partner with you well? Not just partner with you one directional, transactional, but really a partnership and partner with you well. What are some dreams that you have, or just really, laid out tangible?
Good. I think it's 3 things ways you can help. First is prayer. I think prayer is never a secondary act. It is primary. It is ultimately what we wrestle through to figure out our call and where to be. And so I think very equally, we want to live into a spot of let's pray for one another, right? And so we would love to send prayer requests of needs that we begin to have and struggles and challenges that are happening in our community, and trust you have prayer requests here too, and would feel like we can commit to praying for each other. So prayer would be a huge thing. I think a secondary thing is the building we have has pretty much been neglected for 20 years. I forgot to mention that earlier. And so the building that we purchased, ultimately needs new electrical, new plumbing, all your mechanical, new HVAC. There's a ton of work that needs to be done. And so I think if you're skilled, people are skilled in the trades and they want to come, use their God-given abilities to help out, that'd be a huge gift to us. We're getting plans and permits finished by the end of the year, and so the beginning of the year, we're ready to start the rebuilding process. And so that would be really exciting for us. And then, a third thing is financial support to be helping with our space. I think the part I love about, growing up in Wisconsin, being present here in Iowa, is so many of the small businesses that are there and wanting to give people those options to live into that. And I think also just many people here understand the biggest cost to anything is your startup cost. And that's kind of where we're at right now. It's a large price tag, but we see this being a way to live on mission and support the mission in the long haul. But we also know the price tag's large for us in the beginning to start these things. And I guess like a good preacher, I said 3 and I'll add one more. I think in every one of these things we see relationships to be the main thing. And I would just love for us to be dreaming even beyond, us getting to see you and coming our way, but for us to even wonder about, too often people come to missions in our neighborhood. And it's been fun for us to take some people in our community out of our community and just the richness they experience and how great would it be to come to Northwest Iowa and see your space here.
Yeah, I think that's a really fun dream. I appreciate you coming and sharing kind of the vision, the goals, and really taking it really down to the roots of like, maybe there's somebody just listening and they're like, well, I could do that. And hopefully pushing them out of their comfort zone, but understanding like that's where God meets us, is where we're uncomfortable.
Yes.
So I really appreciate you coming, and hopefully as we keep growing in this relationship, that we'll start to understand one another. And when you talk about your needs or when you talk about the building, that it's just common for people to go, oh, I know what that is.
Yes.
Like that, to me, is the goal of what missional relationship looks like. And I think it's really cool that you guys are joining in the Kingdom Network as well. And so it seems like a really great start to something new. And I just feel like that, like where your hair raises on your arms and like God's about to do something.
Yes.
And how exciting that we get to be part of it. So is there anything else that you want to add that we missed?
Yeah, I just think it just feels like a joy to even the beginning stages of this, of the partnership in the gospel, and just to feel like, hey, it's one already that you see, even a dozen faces that came out our way, and just look forward to more of that. And so grateful for the investment, and looking forward to what God's going to do in the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully we answered some of your questions of what this partnership can look like moving forward.
Grace and peace.